Today is our last regular Sunday worship gathering of the year. And I always feel a little bit of extra, I don't know if it's pressure or, compulsion or something like that to somehow wrap up the previous year while simultaneously helping us set an intention and an aim for the following year. And then also be faithful to the text and the series that we put together long before this moment, and do all of that in our 20-minute homily slot. And I want you to know that I'm not going to do any of those three things with the justice that they deserve, but I'm going to take some version of a crack at that. This time of year, I find myself reflecting on a quote from the late, great Frederick Buechner that says, "Here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid." Here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid. And I find it to be a bit of a paraphrase of some words of Jesus where he says, "In this world you will experience trouble, but take heart, for I've overcome the world." This last year held a lot of beautiful and terrible things. I don't need to list those things for you to remember what they are. In fact, I strongly encourage some sort of a year-end audit of your calendar to remember all of the things that happened. You might think your memory good until you look back at your calendar and realize there were some things that happened in February or in April or in August that you've long forgotten. You'll find out all kinds of things when you do this. It'll be all the mundane things like getting your car registration renewed, and all of the spectacular things like a family vacation, maybe a new job or something like that. You'll also be reminded of some difficult things, some challenging things. So be ready as you go into that experience to reflect on things that kind of run the gamut of human experience and emotion. 2025 will hold beautiful and terrible things as well. How are you prepared for that? What is it that you've done, or what is it you're going to do in the next week or week and a half that will prepare you for the beautiful and terrible things that will happen in 2025? We try to model the spiritual practices of celebration and lament for you on Sundays so that you have something to sort of base your spiritual practices on. If you need help taking those corporate practices and personalizing them, you can talk with me or Maggie or Sunny at any point. We'd love to help you do that. But sometimes that's the paradigm that we can use to prepare ourselves for the beautiful and the terrible, celebration and lament. I'll have more on that as we move along this morning, but before I get too far into reflection and looking forward, I want to jump into one last messianic prophecy together for this year. From the book of Numbers, chapter 24, verses 15 through 19. Then he spoke his message, the prophecy of Balaam, son of Beor, the prophecy of the one whose eye sees clearly, the prophecy of the one who hears the words of God, who has knowledge from the Most High, who sees a vision from the Almighty, who falls prostrate and whose eyes are opened. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of the people of Sheth. Edom will be conquered. Seir, his enemy, will be conquered. But Israel will grow strong. A ruler will come out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city. As we've said throughout this series, these prophecies as they stand alone make almost no sense at all without some kind of context. You have to kind of be oriented to where things are and how things are taking place in order to understand them. So I'll start with this. The book of Numbers gets a bad rap. It's not a book that many people look at, study, read at all. There are a lot of people that I know who have read almost the entire Bible, and if I were to ask them what they skipped over, it was the book of Numbers, maybe a couple of others in the Old Testament as well. It oftentimes is ignored, and that's because the first 4 chapters are just lists of names, just lists of people, and that's where the book gets its name. It's census data, essentially. At Sinai, the people of God were instructed to take a census, so they knew who was with them. And then every chapter after the 4th chapter is a really crucial piece of the chronicling of God's people's movement from Sinai to the promised land. It plays a really crucial role in the story of the people of God, but it gets overlooked because of those first few chapters. If you get one chapter in or two chapters in, you start to get the idea that maybe this is what the whole book is about, and you kind of just quit. I don't think I'm supposed to recommend that you skip over any part of the Bible, but I will say if you have to pick something, don't pick the whole book, just pick the first 4 chapters. There's some really beautiful stuff in the entirety of the book, but especially in the back half. Now, in this book, like throughout the Old Testament, God speaks to his people in many different ways, and one of the prominent primary ways that God speaks to his people is through prophets. In this case, the prophet Balaam. The prophet who spoke the words above, the he who spoke this message is the prophet that we'll focus on this morning. He's a fascinating character in the story of God's people because he was a legitimate prophet and at the same time, kind of a bad dude. Or in the end, he ended up kind of being a bad dude. He's not looked on favorably when it comes to the history of God's people. In fact, Peter, in his second letter, writes this: "They have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Bezer, who loved the wages of wickedness." And yet, not only was this a legitimate prophet, meaning like a legitimate mouthpiece for Yahweh, but this prophet holds a messianic prophecy, delivers a messianic prophecy. Not just a legitimate prophet, but specifically a messianic prophet, which makes this prophet doubly important for Christians. The story reminds me a bit of the pattern that emerged in our Genealogy of Jesus series. You might remember that series from a couple of months ago. That is, the foundation of God's kingdom is laid with broken bricks. So many of the important people who led to the birth of the Messiah, who were heroes of the faith, who were with Jesus for years throughout his ministry, and even with him at the Last Supper, they turned out to be weak or selfish or abusers of power and more. And yet God uses them to make up the founding fathers and mothers of our faith, which gives me hope that God could use me too. It gives me some sort of insight into the kind of people that God draws into himself to carry out his work. And Balaam is not much different. He found a way to have his cake and eat it too. He found a way to be a mouthpiece for Yahweh and at the same time sort of pursue the worldly pleasures that he so desired. I know the key thing about Balaam, which would fall into like a character study if we were to do this at some point, it's like really interesting, and yet I don't know that it is something we can focus on today, is that he wasn't an Israelite. God used someone not like them to be a mouthpiece to them. That's exegetically significant, and I'm exercising a lot of restraint to not talk about it right now because there's a whole lot of other stuff we need to get to. And out of his mouth, despite not being an Israelite, despite pursuing his own desires and even betraying the people of God, come these words: "A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel." A messianic prophecy. Now, as Brandy so aptly pointed out last week, not all messianic prophecies were about Jesus per se, even if they are applied to Jesus or attributed to Jesus. There's a lot of unpacking theologically and exegetically that we could do there, but suffice to say that Israel, throughout their history, had a lot of false starts, a lot of close calls with messiahs. A lot of times where that person looks like they could be the Messiah, they fit the criteria, this could be the person that saves us, and then they were deeply disappointed when that person had a fatal flaw. And that happened time and time and time again in their history, and it is likely what led to their rejection of Jesus as the Messiah, what led to their rejection of and eventually their crucifixion of Jesus as the Messiah. They weren't going to get hurt again, essentially. And so it was hard for them to see past some of the things that looked to them like disappointments in Jesus because they had been let down so many times. It is likely that that played a role. Now, I hate to state the obvious here because you're all intelligent people, and I don't mean to insult that in any way. But when words like star and scepter are used to describe the Messiah, these are metaphors. Jesus is not actually a star and not actually a scepter. I know you know that, but I think it's important to call that out. Now, since scepter isn't exactly a Christmas symbol, we'll focus on the star metaphor this morning for just a moment. You'll see stars all the time this time of year. You'll see them in lots of different places. I'm sure there are some behind me or near me or something like that. I was just, as I was coming here today, noticed that there's a gigantic star on top of the huge Christmas tree that replaces the fountain every year in the circle right outside this building. Massive star. And a lot of times the star, when asked about it by children to their parents, the parents will give the answer, the reason why we have a star, the reason why there's stars all around, Christmas cookies will take this shape, you'll see it at the tops of trees, you'll see it on clothing and things like that. The reason for that is because the Magi, the wise men, the kings that follow a star to find Jesus, they look to that star as their guidepost. They look to that star as their guiding light to discover the Messiah after he was born. And although there's truth to that, Jesus himself is described as a star. Jesus himself is the star that comes out of Jacob, the star of David, the star of this lineage. You see, the star that came to the Magi was a star that came out of Bethlehem, a place, okay? It came out of a place. This star that we're talking about here, this star that we're talking about today, comes out of a people, comes out of a lineage, comes out of the line of Jacob. That's the primary reason, or at least the initial reason, why stars have become so significant for Christians this time of year. They kind of play second fiddle to a lot of other symbolism, but my guess is after today, just learning that little bit, you might see them a little bit more regularly for the next week or so. They're kind of everywhere. Stars have two major properties that I think are really important for our understanding of this metaphor for the Messiah. And in case you care, and in case you're wondering, what we're doing right now is called Christology. It's where we're looking at a very specific element or a subcategory of theology to understand the entirety of God better by understanding a piece of God better, okay? So Jesus, a person of the Trinity, to understand God as a whole better, we understand pieces of God better, and we start sometimes with the Son of God in Christology. It's especially important in Advent when we're discovering who God is and how God is coming to us. The first property of a star that makes it a perfect imagery for who Jesus is that a star emits and emanates light. But not just any kind of light, a very specific, powerful light that pierces darkness. The light that the star emanates, the light that Jesus emanates, pierces darkness. Space is vacuous and dark. I think it's pretty terrifying, to be honest with you. When I think about it long enough, there's not a lot that scares me in the world. Space kind of freaks me out. I saw the movie Gravity in theaters, and my back was so sweaty. I was so stressed out by that movie. I felt the same way about The Martian, the sequence kind of near the end where he's using his holes in his gloves to steer him back towards the spacecraft. It's super stressful, very terrifying. Space is vacuous and tremendously dark. And yet light from stars finds a way to pierce the darkness. It is so powerful and it is so strong that it can pierce the darkness not just in the immediate vicinity, but light years away. The light that we see oftentimes when we look up at the night sky, that light doesn't actually exist anymore. Those stars have died. But the light is still coming to us because it is powerful and it pierces darkness. Light reminds us that there's something there that has so much power that darkness cannot overcome it. Darkness cannot overwhelm it. Even if it's just a glimmer of it that we get, just a glimpse of its presence, we know that it's there. Now, you can really nerd out on stars and space in general if you just spend a little bit of time on the internet. I got a little distracted by that this week, if I'm honest with you. And one of the things I learned is that there's a star out there nicknamed Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And my daughter's name is Lucy, so it probably caught my eye for that reason. But then it caught my eye for a few other reasons as well. Let me tell you about this star. It's a white dwarf star in the constellation Centaurus that astronomers discovered in 2004, so 20 years ago. Its size is about 4,000 kilometers in diameter. Its weight, this is interesting, 10 billion trillion carats. Anytime you start to describe something of this magnitude, you sound like a 6-year-old. Like you're just adding billion and trillion and gajillion, and you're making up numbers. And then if you add, it's not carrots like the vegetable, but if you think of it as carrots like the vegetable, then you sound even more like a 6-year-old. Americans will use anything but the metric system, right? The temperature of this star is about 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which I learned recently is actually a very cool star. It's pretty chill. It's not like our sun, which is like 27 million degrees Fahrenheit. It has burned up most of its gas, and that's why it's cooling. It's about 50 light years from Earth. So it's pretty far away, but not like crazy, crazy far. The star is a remnant of a star similar to our sun that's used up most of its fuel, and it started to cool This star has enormous gravity. It's converted most of its carbon into crystal through pressure and heat. So think back to your science classes in high school when you have carbon that's exposed to a lot of pressure and a lot of heat, and it crystallizes, it becomes a diamond. So it is thought that the core of this star is a diamond that is 10 billion trillion carats. The core of this star is a diamond, one gigantic continuous diamond. It is dense, it is heavy, it has a tremendous gravitational pull. And that's the second important property of stars that I think applies to the beauty and the magnificence of Jesus. Jesus has a strong and persistent gravitational pull that is very difficult to ignore. You can try, some of you do, I have at times in my life, but you can't quite sidestep it. You can't quite ignore it. The magnetism of God's love through Jesus draws us, it pulls us in. Jesus is a light that pierces darkness. The light has shined in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. We repeat that so much throughout the year, and especially this time of year. Jesus also draws us to himself with a spectacular love that surpasses our comprehension and understanding. Some of you are and have been resisting that pull. Some of you are trying to ignore the gravity that God has that's pulling you in. Some of you are thinking, if I can distance myself enough, maybe I won't feel the tug so much. And I understand that. And I've been there. You are trying that because you're disappointed. You're frustrated. You're angry. You look back on some of these circumstances of your life or the people around you that you love and care about, and you're mad. And you feel like God's to blame, and so you try to distance yourself. I don't blame you for that. But I also want to remind you that Jesus offers a swap of burdens that is so significant that in drawing you to himself, he's not asking you to take on more. He's asking you to give up more. He's asking you to take on less. There's a moment in Jesus' ministry where he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy burdened, all who are tired or exhausted, and I will give you rest. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Let's swap. And I'd like to submit to you that perhaps if your image of Jesus is one that lays on a heavier burden, that makes your life more difficult, tiresome, wearisome, frustrating, that causes you harm, perhaps you've got a distorted view of who Jesus is. And maybe resisting that gravitational pull is not actually in your best interest. It feels protective, but it's actually harmful. Some of you are doing just fine with Jesus. In fact, you're a little superior about it. Some of you are the star in the metaphor. You have your own gravitational pull. You're drawing Jesus to you. You are faithful, and you're true, and you're right. And because of that, you feel as though you're kind of in the center of the story. Allow me to gently remind you that it's the other way around. We humbly succumb to the beautiful draw of Jesus in our life. We submit to it, we let go, and allow ourselves to be drawn to it. That is the way of Jesus. It is not one of superiority. It's not one of superior spirituality, where everyone looks to us as an example. It's one of humble submission, where we let go and allow ourselves to be drawn into the presence of Jesus. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Come to Jesus, all who are tired and weighed down. He'll swap burdens with you. That's the invitation of the gospel. The gospel that's so core and central to who we are as followers of the way of Jesus. And if I have to take this whole last year and think about it and summarize some things, and if I have to think about this whole next year and think about it and summarize some things and prepare us, and I have to think about the advent of the presence of God through Jesus, the incarnation of that which was spiritual and immaterial, that becoming flesh and blood and moving into the neighborhood. I have to take all of that and think of all of those things and jam those together into one central idea. It would be this: Jesus' light pierces the darkness, and Jesus is the gravitational pull that we should probably just give up on and just let ourselves be drawn into it. When we fight against it and push against it, it ends up being more burdensome and more tiring. As you look forward to 2025, some of you feel tired and burdened. Remember that Jesus offers to swap that with you. As you look back on 2024, some of you are thinking there was a lot of darkness or there was a lot of pain. Remember that the light of Jesus pierces that and moves through that. There is so much beauty to be celebrated. Behold, a star has risen. That star represents a great and tremendous hope. A great and tremendous hope that not all is lost. Not even you. Not all is lost. Not even that friend or family member. Not all is lost. Not even that relationship or that thing, that dream that you had. These things are not lost, and we know that because there's great hope in the star that has risen out of Jacob, that comes from that lineage, that was prophesied long ago and came to fulfillment in the birth of Christ. Every light that you see at different points throughout this season of Advent is meant to remind us of something. We had Christmas lights all around, right? Like around our house, inside and outside. We light lots of extra candles. On Christmas Eve in here, this room at one point will be completely lit by candles that you hold in your hands. It's spectacular. And my hope is that you look at that little flickering light and you're reminded that Christ's presence is here and it's drawing you to him. The love of God manifest in Jesus is drawing you in. That's my hope for you this holiday season. Merry Christmas. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for the light that you emit, that you emanate. Thank you for the power of that light to pierce through the darkness. Thank you for the gravitational pull that draws us to you. Would you help us to quit resisting it? Or would you help us to quit attributing it to ourselves? Whichever is our typical leaning. We love you, God. We're so grateful for all the things you've given us. And we pray these things in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.